The desktop. And then I delete them after the meetings are over.
Sometimes it doesn't. Your computers don't like to save things on the desktop sometimes.
Okay.
Well, as long as this isn't going to cut out. I can just run the phone.
You can go to That's it. Okay. There we go. So it's saved on H.
Okay.
So whatever. Okay. If you guys need to use these microphones, if you want to use the wireless or anything, there's a power button here, and then a power switch on top.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Okay, I'll wait for a few minutes, make sure everything goes good. Sorry, it took a little longer than
No
anticipated.
worries. So this is.
Yeah, and it's on, so it should be. Oh, you're not?
Can we switch it back again? Sorry.
Sorry. Technological difficulties. Have some coffee. Our DL is not broadcasting. Right?
Is it? Working?
Yes.
Back this way.
Did you want it extended? The display so that you see this and then the face. See this.
I think it's just
Never mind.
I'll just put it on the slideshow, right? Good. On. Well, thank you so much for your patience and welcome to our Great Ideas in Teaching
lecture series. I'm Cindy Hill. I'm an economics professor, and I oversee the Student Success Center here. And as you know, many of you have been here for the last couple of lectures. We've asked some of our amazing teachers from across campus to share some of their insights with regard to teaching. So I wanted just to make you all aware that our Great Ideas in Teaching, the lecture from Donna Liebecker, is now up on our success page down here, the very bottom on your left-hand side. You can click on Great Ideas in Teaching. Karen Appleby's presentation isn't up yet, but it should be up quite soon. So in terms of where we're going still, we have a panel discussion on November 2nd, and then Catherine Black from the Department of Biological Sciences will be with us on November 16th. So just so you have some more specific information with regard to what's happening on November 2nd, we have representatives from all of the colleges who will be attending or providing insights. So we're going to do it in a round table format. So it'll be a little bit different than what we've been doing previously. So Paul Link from Cozy, Darren Levitt from College of Technology, Don Konasek from College of Business, Alex Erfer, he's actually retired, but coming back to spend some time with us, from the Division of Health Sciences, Robin Lindbeck from the College of Education, Bethany Schultz-Hurst from College of Arts and Letters, as well as Mark Beth from the College of Arts and Letters. So it'd be great to see you all back there again. So before I introduce our distinguished teacher today, I just wanted to make sure any of the chemistry enthusiasts in the room that there's a chemistry seminar this afternoon at 1 o'clock by Dr. Scott Donaldson. So that will be over in the physical science building at 1 o'clock this afternoon. So now it's my honor to introduce to you Dr. Andy Holland. Dr. Holland is an associate professor of chemistry here at Idaho State University. His current research focuses on understanding reactivity of transition metals in order to make better materials for catalysis and electronics. Those research students who are fortunate to get the opportunity to work with Andy learn techniques for handling compounds that are unstable to ambient atmosphere. His teaching focus is general, organic, and inorganic chemistry. Notably, Dr. Holland has coordinated a summer chemistry internship program for disadvantaged high school students for the past 10 years. Dr. Holland earned his Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from the University of Washington and his PhD from University of California at Berkeley in mechanistic organometallic chemistry. I told him that this is the only time I've had to go to dictionary.com and have them pronounce things for me to help with this presentation. Economists don't talk like this. Dr. Holland is well known across campus for his dedication to students and student learning and has won numerous mentoring and teaching awards to this end. In both 2008 and 2015, he was honored as Master Teacher, and earlier this year, in 2018, named the Distinguished Teacher for Idaho State University. Please help me welcome Dr. Andy Holland.
Thanks, Cindy, both for the introduction, A+ pronunciation on organometallic, and also for the invitation to talk today. I think this is a great idea, and I've been kind of bummed that I wasn't able to make it to the previous two installments. In fact, when Cindy called me, I was so delighted to participate that I agreed right off the bat and actually was already cycling into second thoughts about that decision before I was even off the phone. So I'm not a teaching researcher, so I think I'm much less prepared than a lot of my colleagues would be to talk about it's sort of the language of data-driven pedagogical innovation. So I can't give a talk in that form. And I think when my courses succeed, it's usually on account of accumulation of a lot of small things, of details executed well, rather than any overarching strategy or innovation that I can tell you a story about. I think that one of the things that you learn very early on as a teacher is that you need some thread of narrative arc to connect what you're talking about if you want the audience to be able to follow or really remember anything from it. So what to talk about? Another challenge is that I think most of the most important elements of teaching are actually so well known already as to become almost cliches. And when I try to think of what's really most important about teaching, like talk about how you need to bring some energy to the classroom to carry students along in your wake, about how you need to prepare really carefully, right? The maxim that failing to prepare is preparing to fail, I think applies to faculty as much as to students. But as I even start to say those things, I almost roll my eyes because they come across as these sort of smarmy platitudes, in spite of the fact that they are absolutely true and incredibly important to successful teaching. So,
Excuse me, can you stand by the microphone, please?
Oh, sorry. Oh, I can. Is this okay? Well, I can plant myself here, I think. Okay. So what to talk about that doesn't fall into these traps too severely? Well, in the recent weeks, I've been tempted to give a very short talk in order to minimize those platitudes. So I think we can really boil down the key components of teaching to a very small list. We need to organize what we're doing and the content that we're trying to deliver. We need to sort of give students a foundation on which to build and give them, a scaffold, if you will, on which to hang the ideas that we're trying to communicate to them. With that established, we then need to communicate those ideas as clearly as possible. And in doing both of those things, we need to treat students with the respect and compassion that they're due, both as other human beings and as our employers, really, in this endeavor. So that about does it. Thanks for coming. Go Bengals. And it was looking like I might have to give this version up until a few minutes ago. But no, I'm not actually deep enough in my career to get away with giving a talk quite this short. So I need something else to talk about. And fortunately, I think there's another item that I would add to this, which is that in the course of doing all those things, we also need to look for ways to do them better. I think teaching is fundamentally, much more than a lot of other undertakings, always a manner of hitting a moving target, right? The courses change in content in some fields. Even in fields like mine, where the course content is pretty stable, the students are constantly changing. And the cohort that I teach today is radically different in their competencies and their expectations, even than students I taught just 10 years ago. So we constantly need to be adapting to that. I think also, particularly for me and a lot of folks in the sciences, we come into this job with very little formal preparation as teachers. So there's a lot of room for improvement as we advance in our careers. So I'm going to seize on this as my narrative conceit for the talk today and talk about ways in which my thinking about teaching has evolved or maybe crystallized over the years. And that'll also give me an excuse to talk about some specific strategies I use that have been useful, at least to me. So like I said, a lot of us in the sciences take teaching jobs with very little teaching preparation. I actually had 16 hours of formal preparation as a teacher. This was at the start of my graduate student career because I went to a program that particularly valued teaching. So they gave us 2 days of introduction to it. And I taught a few labs, but that's very different than running a course. And most of my information about how to teach effectively has come from watching great teachers. And I've been fortunate to have a lot of outstanding teachers in chemistry who I can acknowledge here for one of the rare opportunities I get to do that. Dave Polson taught me high school chemistry for 3 years, and I'll come back to him. At the University of Washington, Karen Goldberg and Jim Mayer showed me the elegance of inorganic chemistry, and I think showed how you can sell that to students who might not be prepared to fully understand it. It really changed my perspective on what students were up to the task of doing. At UC Berkeley, Carolyn Bertozzi was my first teaching assignment. I TA'd for her organic chemistry class, and her lectures still are the gold standard to which I compare my own on a good day. And then Bob Bergman was my PhD advisor, and his attention to precision and detail in teaching is something that stays with me and still, I think, colors my approach to teaching quite a bit. In addition to learning from these folks, I've also learned from some bad examples. I think that we have all had the experience of taking a course with an instructor who was having maybe a bad semester or was assigned to teach something pretty far outside their wheelhouse. And I don't need to name those folks today, but I think I'm motivated as much by trying to avoid some of the pitfalls that I've seen as I am by trying to emulate the good examples. This is also great consolation to me on days that I give a lecture that I suspect was a stinker, because I know that even though no one learned any chemistry that day, I may have motivated some future teachers to do a better job. But I don't want to dwell too much on the bad examples, because that would be a very dark talk. So to go back to a good example, this is Dave Polson pictured about 30 years before he taught my class. So by the point he was teaching me, he had enough pull in the department to insist on teaching organic chemistry to high school students. And for those of you who aren't aware, this is a class that is a boogeyman to many pre-health students, not usually taught at the high school level, but he was convinced he could do it. It wasn't exactly the same class that I teach here, but he insisted on that, and every 2 years, when he could scrape together enough students, he would teach this course to about 25. And in the 12 or so students in my class who took that course, 3 of us went on to get PhDs in chemistry, 2 more are chemical engineers, and the other 7, I don't know what happened to them. They may also have become chemists. But even 5 out of 12 is a phenomenal record, far in excess of anything I've ever achieved with any of my chemistry classes for general audiences at ISU. So Mr. Polson was definitely doing something right, and I went back to think about what strategies he actually used or what set his course apart. And he had a very dramatic presentation style. I still picture him with his arms outstretched, trying to impress upon us the importance of some chemical idea. He favored, like many chemists do, very corny jokes, typically built around puns on the terminology or the periodic table itself. He gave us open book exams. He always encouraged us to think like a molecule, basically to anthropomorphize chemicals and think about their behavior in terms of their desire to obtain a stable valence electron configuration. And he liked to do colorful demos, usually of the team colors of whoever the Wolverines were going to play that Friday. So I thought back to these ideas, and it really struck me that I actually don't do any of these things, or at least very few of them. I don't think that my presentation style is particularly dramatic. I don't think my jokes are corny, although you'd have to ask my students. I don't give open book exams. I do encourage people to think in terms of what molecules want to do, although I don't exactly use Mr. Polson's words, and I'm not a big fan of demos in lectures. I think labs are another story, but I keep those out of lectures. And I point this out not so much to indict my own teaching as to point out that I think the approaches differ dramatically by the course. So teaching is fundamentally a context-dependent exercise, and what may be perfect in one class is not going to be suitable to another. So today I'll talk about some things that may be useful to individual classes that you're familiar with, but I hope that the sort of process is something that everybody can take something away from. So first, some context on what it is that I'm teaching and what my approaches are intended for. So I'm going to talk mostly with respect to the big service courses that I teach. So I used to teach general chemistry. More recently, I've been teaching organic chemistry, 3301 and 3302. And just in terms of what these classes look like, these typically have 50 to 70 students, and they are a highly motivated and academically successful group for the most part, going on to chemistry majors, pre-pharmacy, pre-medical directions. It's a course with a very well-deserved reputation for difficulty, which is for my good and ill in terms of my interaction with the class. And it has a very natural emphasis on critical problem solving. This is actually why these courses are required for pre-health students, is because it prepares them for thinking skills they need later. So I'm teaching these courses with the intention of remaining true to that and making sure that I deliver that content in addition to the chemistry at the core of it. So if I go back to my first semester teaching, this is or actually my first year teaching, second semester, this was the first time that my thinking about teaching really shifted dramatically. So this was Chem 112 at the time, and the first exam of this semester went pretty well. Students understood kinetics about as well as I expected them to. The second exam fell off a little bit. We were dealing with equilibrium, which combines conceptual stuff and algebra in a way that's challenging to students. They fell off, and then on the third exam, performance really dropped off dramatically because we were dealing with how chemical reactions influence pH, which is a very complicated subject and always a challenge to students. And that low score didn't terribly disappoint me because I knew that was going to be hard material. What disappointed me was that the next test was over much easier material. It was actually stuff near and dear to my heart in inorganic chemistry, but the students, they didn't really recover appreciably at all. And they were just so disappointed after that third exam that they weren't actually prepared to learn. And I don't remember what I actually said at that point in the course, but it was clear what had happened, right? The class morale had just cratered and not actually recovered after that third exam enough to put students in a position where they were actually able to learn. And I know that I said something. I wish I could remember exactly what it was, but I remember I was trying to convince them that this was okay, and I just totally failed to do that. I had lost the class, and that probably wasn't the time to say what needed to be said. Right? I should have found some opportunity earlier to be saying things to prepare them that things were going to be difficult, and I needed to sort of work them through that. So this really showed me, I think for the first time in my career, that even in a big lecture where things are relatively impersonal and there are a lot of students in there, it's still part of my job to maintain a positive atmosphere in that classroom. I think I started teaching with the idea that my job was to go in there and give good lectures, give good tests, have a fair classroom, and that the sort of emotional involvement of the students was entirely beyond my responsibility. And I realized that semester that that really wasn't true. If my goal was to teach the students, then if they were angry with me, or if they were disengaged with the course, or I think worst off, if they were terrified by the course, or simply crushed by an exam, they weren't actually in a position to learn. And I think that's the first time that I really undertook as one of my goals, maintaining a classroom atmosphere that was really conducive to learning. And one thing that actually really struck me this spring or this fall in President Satterley's presentation at the beginning of the semester, he talked about some management theory on what is actually necessary for employees to thrive in the workplace. And he listed these 4 criteria of trust, compassion, stability, and hope as being necessary for employees to thrive. And that really resonated with me because I think it's exactly the same list of things that students need to really thrive and achieve at their utmost in courses. And I won't walk through these, but I think it's obvious to see how trust in the instructor, stability of the course structure, and all these things really relate to student achievement. So why wasn't I on board with that approach initially? I think I was skeptical of trying to control the student's mood because I think there are a lot of wrong ways that can be done. I think we're all sort of aware of what they are. Right? You can win student goodwill by sort of pandering to the student's short-term desires, by making a course that's constructed more from jokes than from actual content, by giving very easy tests and correspondingly high grades, by giving students days off anytime you have an excuse to do that, and sort of fostering a familiar, very chummy relationship with the students. And I was always very skeptical of that because I thought it undercut the goals of the course. But I don't think any of those things are actually necessary, and they underrate what students are really looking for in a course. I think you can achieve exactly the same type of atmosphere by giving useful lectures that students appreciate as filling their needs, by giving fair tests that accurately reflect student learning and relate to your priorities in the course, by making sure that the time that the students spend in lecture and doing homework and other things outside of class is actually well spent and not busy work, but productive towards the ends of the class, and an atmosphere of mutual respect where even though you're not the student's buddy, they trust you to have their interests at heart. So there's really no need to ingratiate yourself to students or pander to them to maintain this positive class atmosphere. I think it is important, though, to think carefully about how to actually communicate the attitude that you want. I think we all know, anyone who teaches knows that they're doing it because they're concerned about students' future, and they have a lot of compassion for the student experience, and that's a really prime in the front of their mind during the entire teaching process. But students don't know this. At least they don't necessarily know this, and particularly in a very challenging course, they sometimes view the instructor more as a sadist than someone who's actually looking out for their own interests. So I think especially in challenging courses, it's really important to tell and really show the students that you have their interests at heart and that you see them as people. So I do a number of things that may have some direct benefit on learning, but I really prioritize, mostly because I think it communicates that attitude and fosters that environment in the class. I could list a whole lot of things here, but just to pick a few, responding to emails and grading tests very quickly. I'm going to have to do it sometime. I might as well do it promptly. I try to learn names and also use them during lectures. I think it's obvious that there's some benefit to addressing a student by their name to that student, but that also has a benefit to the rest of the class. So even if I'm having a conversation just with Zach throughout the course, if I keep referring to him as Zach, all the other students still recognize that as a personal interaction, and it has value to them, not just to the individual student. So even sometimes you can get away with only learning about 5 names for the students, and those are the only ones that you talk to during lecture. I also try to avoid adversarial relationships with students whenever possible. I know plenty of faculty who get frustrated with students and almost see them as the enemy in the class, and I think that that's really damaging to class atmosphere. Obviously, the worst instance of that is when cheating becomes an issue, and this is something that we've had big concerns with in my college over the recent years. So there are 2 approaches, I think, that you can take towards cheating. One is to bust cheaters and have sort of a surveillance setup within your classroom when you're giving exams so that you can catch people in the act and punish them accordingly. The other approach, though, is to prevent cheating in the first place, and that's where I put my effort. So I actually give exams outside of class time anyway because I like to give more time on exams. That means that I can move to a giant room where students are far away from each other and not really able to copy. It's also easier for me to watch them under those circumstances and make sure that nobody has notes. When we're not doing work that I'm supervising in person, I like to minimize the incentives for cheating. So that means on outside of class work that students do, I generally try to minimize the points awarded for that so that there isn't much pressure for them to actually get a perfect score on that assignment that might drive them towards cheating. And if I know that collaboration is going to happen, for instance, if I give a very challenging take-home problem and I know that students are either going to talk to each other about it or be very sorely tempted to do that when they see their roommate doing the same thing, I try not to put them in that moral dilemma and to just invite them to collaborate on that anyway. And I think I lose the opportunity to evaluate them on the grounds of that particular assignment, but I think the benefit of that outweighs that small cost. And I'll talk more about assessment and evaluation going forward here. Another thing that's become obvious to me is that students and I have a very different perspective on the class, so I make a big effort to sell them on my perspective. I think our education system from very early on convinces students that what they're doing there is trying to clear a bar, that courses are mostly about evaluation, about showing that they are smart and can get a good grade, and that will then take them to the next step of the career that they want. Of course, that's not my goal at all. I have to evaluate students, but I'm in there to try to deliver them skills that will allow them to actually succeed in that next step. And I think that to the extent I can convince students over to my side of that equation, the happier they are to be patient with my efforts in the class, and the more resilient they are in the face of sometimes adverse test outcomes. So thus far I've been talking about things that I've learned about teaching in the course of teaching, from observing students and from assessment data in classes. But I've also learned a lot from areas outside the direct classroom. So I had one realization in the context of a giant convention center, sort of like this room in the modular setup, but with these 40-foot tall ceilings and these giant convention centers, apparently designed for when giraffes start to go to chemistry conventions. But all of these convention centers and all these academic talks are sort of the same. And I was struck one day towards the end of a series of talks by just how different that environment is from the teaching environment, even though this is actually where most of us learn to lecture, right? We go to these talks, we give lectures, that's sort of how we learn to put together slides and give a talk. And it's actually directly opposed to what we really want to do in lectures in the classroom. So I won't slander any other fields at the moment, but in chemistry, the quote-unquote ideals for these professional presentations are that you go really fast to impress people with the quantity of research that you've done and your command of it. If anything, you err on the side of really overestimating the audience's knowledge. You skip over things that everybody should know so that you demonstrate that, of course, everybody should know that, right? You demonstrate your savvy by skipping subjects. And the goal here is to make sure that you appear smart and capable as you're giving that talk, right? Almost everyone in these settings is trying to further their career, and the way that you further your career is basically showing that you're smart. And of course, this is all exactly the opposite of the ideals for actually lecturing to students. So it's unfortunate that this is the primary preparation that many of us get to actually moving to the classroom and talking to students every day. So what's the issue with this? I think that the problem with these presentations, in addition to those ideals that I talked about, is that often if you give an eloquent enough presentation and a careful enough presentation, you can deliver the sensation of learning without any learning actually taking place, right? In a few slides, I'm going to talk to you about stereochemistry, which is a very complicated subject, and on a good day, I could probably convince you in 30 seconds or a minute of describing stereochemistry that it's not really that hard, that you kind of get it, and if you just had 2 or 3 minutes to sit down and look at it, you'd really get it, right? And we've all talked to people who have gotten this impression from talks, and that's not the case. I think in the effort to deliver something smoothly, it's very common to sort of elide gaps in understanding and not take the time to build the structure to correct them. And I think the worst offenders for this are TED Talks, which are sometimes very effective in communicating one idea or maybe selling one idea, but don't tend to actually teach very much of anything. So these are not the ideals that we want to take into the classroom. So what do I try to do instead? Obviously, we need to deliver information in as clear a way as possible. I think there's certainly some overlap. And I should say that these sort of highly prepared talks do have some value since I'm giving one at this very moment. But in a lecture, when I'm talking to students, my goals are to not only communicate information, but actually confront students with the limits of their understanding and point out to them where they're confused and where they don't actually understand things as well as they think they do. Because if they leave lecture having been convinced that they understand the subject, they're not going to do a lot of work on that outside the classroom. And in my courses, they really have to in order to succeed. So I try to make sure that they are aware at some point in the class that they don't get it yet. I also try to seek student feedback. I think that questions during lecture are the best information I get about where I'm succeeding and where I'm not and where I can improve. So there are lots of ways to do these things. And I think it's interesting to note that a lot of the very popular recent-ish innovations in teaching allow for both of these things. So flipped classrooms, where students watch videos ahead of class and then do worksheets or problems in class, give lots of faculty-student interaction that can allow for these two features. Also use of clickers, where you insist that students answer a question to be recorded for a grade during the lecture, does the same thing. But these innovations aren't necessarily required to accomplish this. I actually don't use either of those, at least in the full version in my classrooms. But I do frequently stop and ask questions with the goal of showing students that it's not so easy as it looks and getting them to ask questions and sort of structure questions around their difficulty doing those problems. Another thing that took me a long time to realize is that repetition is actually incredibly powerful in lectures. As a lecturer, it sounds terrible. You feel like you're just rambling, and it doesn't feel very eloquent. But I've noticed in observing some lectures that it's an incredibly powerful way to actually drive home a point. I particularly like it now when students ask a question that I just answered, because it gives me an opportunity to repeat the same idea in slightly different words. And if the student didn't get it the first time, that's a good indication that they were busy processing something else, and that was an important subject to hit again. So to repeat something that I just said on the last slide, polish of a lecture is not the same as usefulness. And I think we want to rate the usefulness, not the quality of the lecture in terms of its entertainment value or its slickness. It is traditional among all faculty to bemoan the time that we spend doing committee service. But I've actually learned a lot from some of my committee service. Several years ago, I joined the Gen Ed Requirements Committee with no idea of what it did, just because I knew that my other committee service had elapsed, and I wanted to be on some sort of a committee. Little did I know that about a year after I joined, the accreditors would come through and point out that we actually weren't assessing our general education program at all, and that was probably something that we ought to do if we wanted to remain an accredited university. So this sparked a major project on this committee to actually try to devise and start to implement a program by which to assess the courses in our general education based on an outcome-based approach. And this was actually the first time I had really thought very hard about the difference between assessment and evaluation, right? Between looking at course outcomes and looking at students. And in the process of doing this and talking to other folks in my college made me think very differently about the alignment of these different purposes within a course. So, namely, in the sciences, at least, there's a very strong correlation between the types of assignments that we give and what it's traditionally assumed to accomplish in the course. We assign some homework and some worksheets, and that's intended to deliver on the learning, right? Students draw connections as they do that work. They drill their skills, and that's really the primary focus of sort of delivering that education in the first place. And then we use quizzes and exams sort of interchangeably to do both outcome assessment and see if the objectives of the course are being reached, and also do evaluation and assign students grades. And those are almost always lumped together. But these groupings are not necessarily how it has to be. And I think there's a pretty strong case that we can do any of those things in any of those different assignments. And I've tried to be much more deliberate in how I think about aligning these different purposes with the different assignments that I give. And I can't talk too much about this without getting into the weeds of chemistry education. So I'll just give a couple examples that I think are a little bit more general. One thing I really like to do is use exams as learning experiences. And I think this is an underrated opportunity because when students are taking exams, that is when they are most prepared since they've studied for the exam. And it's also a time when they are very motivated to try to work through problems. So there are questions that I can ask on homework assignments. I can give it 3 points to the question, and a significant portion of the students will decide that dealing with that question is not worth those 3 points, and they'll just leave it and try to get their points elsewhere. If I give the same question on an exam, students are far more motivated to at least take a good crack at drawing the connection. So I like to ask questions where I pull together a couple of ideas. For those of you who have gone ahead and read the text there and understood any of it, congratulations. But if you haven't, let me translate that. Basically, what I'm trying to do is to make students draw a connection between some new subject that they've just learned and some subject that they encountered previously in the curriculum. I think that's a very powerful aspect of learning and something that I can best get them to do while they're taking exams. This is a little bit tricky. To do this fairly requires that I don't assign a lot of points to these questions, and sometimes the light bulb just doesn't go on and you can't make that connection. It also requires long exams so that students don't penalize themselves by spending a lot of time on these more challenging questions. Grading rubric needs to be pretty generous. So I think there are some challenges to this, but I think this is very valuable. Another thing I like to use exam questions for is actually just communicating the values for the class that I have already talked about. So one question that I like to give is to ask students to explain some concept that they studied for really hard but didn't get to show off elsewhere on the exam. And this has no particular assessment value because it's not tied to any given outcome. It has no particular evaluation value because the students are all going to get full credit on this if they actually take the time to answer it. But what it does is it reinforces these ideas that things not on the exam still matter. Just because we're not measuring it doesn't mean it isn't important. It recognizes personal growth as really the goal of the class and gives some students credit for doing that. And it also has some value, not so much for outcome assessment, but in a more general sense, of showing me what students have absorbed in the class, what they really value from what they've learned. So it's very useful to me, even if it isn't on an outcome-by-outcome approach. So I think just generally, activities can be really useful outside their traditional purposes. I haven't talked about this, but also I think I get better assessment from low-stakes activities than from quizzes and exams. We can do activities that have no value at all for evaluation and assessment. I think sometimes people ignore opportunities or possibilities because they think, well, how am I going to grade this? Just because you can't grade it doesn't mean it doesn't have value to the students. And I think this just requires some careful deliberation about where to put what purposes in terms of how it aligns with different activities in the class. I've also learned some lessons from teaching from some consulting that I sort of stumbled into. A common, really a perennial concern in chemistry is how to deal with differing student preparation coming out of high school. Because we have one general chemistry course that most scientists are going to take, and high schools teach chemistry in very different ways at very different levels. So we're always trying to deal with that difference. I've long been advocating for using one of these online systems that actually diagnoses where students are at and then tries to essentially remediate them to get them all up to a common level where they can come into our courses and succeed. And in the course of investigating this, I talked to some friends who were working with a company called Alex and then ended up doing some consulting with them. And the idea within this company, within this particular tool, which has been used both for math for a long time and more recently for chemistry, is to do very fine-grained assessment to figure out exactly where students are with extremely targeted problems that are very finely honed to get at very specific questions, and then they sort of feed those results into a computer that tells them what the prerequisite structure should be, and that refines the structure of this learning tool. And this made me think much harder about how my questions aligned with specific assessment and how I might be better off approaching it from this model of really breaking down questions into as finely grained a form as I possibly can. So give one example of this. So this is stereochemistry that I mentioned before. This has to do with the three-dimensional relationships between molecules. So we can categorize two molecules based on whether they differ in their orientation on the page, in which case they're the same molecule, or they're rotated around a bond, or they are mirror images of each other. These represent atoms behind the plane. These represent atoms in front of the plane of the screen. So these are three-dimensional pictures of these structures. And this is a very common question on just about every standardized exam in organic chemistry that asks students to look at these two structures and categorize them based on one of those terms. What this question actually requires the students to do is a whole series of steps. They need to be able to take that molecule and rotate it in space, just pick it up and rotate it clockwise 180 degrees. They need to be able to visualize rotating around one of the bonds to reorient the conformation of the molecule. And then they need to be able to take the result and compare that to another structure using the definition to figure out which of those categories it falls into. So this is good as an evaluation question because it tests a bunch of things at once, but it's terrible as an assessment question because students can fail anywhere along this line, which means it doesn't give very much information to me, right? I don't know which of these three steps the students has failed at if I give this question. So I think it's typically much more valuable to break down these questions into individual pieces. Right, I can ask them to go through each of those three steps individually by drawing the result of the rotation, by drawing the result of the conformational change, by drawing the enantiomer of the pictured structure. And this gives me much more information about what the students can actually accomplish. And I should say I think that the capstone questions that combine these concepts are important in their own right, but they shouldn't be the default when we're trying to teach these subjects. So just generally, I think breaking down complex questions into several parts is often the better strategy. So these simpler questions offer more precise feedback. They offer more confidence to the students, right? If they get that big question wrong, that's 0 points out of whatever. If I break it down, they can get credit for what they do know. In some cases, it leads to easier grading. Not at all. In this example, grading drawings is much worse than grading a multiple choice selection. But in a lot of cases, it actually avoids some complicated partial credit considerations. And this was a breakthrough for me because I really like to write hard questions. I like to write elegant questions that challenge the students. But I sort of realized I was doing that for me, not for the students. And I always want to question whether what I'm doing is for my own benefit or because it's actually the most useful way to teach the subject. So I hope that what I've shown is that teaching ideas can come from a lot of unexpected places, but they can also come from much more traditional locations. Like the education literature has lots of great ideas that I've tried to build from. My colleagues have given me lots of great advice. My own research, in some cases, has given me ideas for specific problems or ways to tackle subjects differently. And of course, course evaluations sometimes have useful feedback. And let me talk about that last one for a minute. Because I think it's very hard to hear this feedback sometime. And I'm including this mostly because as a thank you to whatever student wrote this particular objection, because it was really important for me in terms of thinking about how I teach. So one time a student complained, and this is to paraphrase, that I used too many bad examples during my lecture that contradicted the main theme of what we were trying to learn. And the student wanted to know how they were supposed to keep track of what the right answer actually was. And my initial response to this from the gut level was not very positive because this was very frustrating given what I was trying to do with the class. I looked for a long time trying to find an appropriately angry font to put that text in since that was actually the nature of my response. Because what I'm trying to do in the class is teach them how to do critical thinking, among other things, right? So the whole point in a lot of these subjects is not what the right answer is, it's the process by which we get to that right answer or the way that we can critically approach it and make sure that it really is the right answer. So that totally defeated the purpose of what we were trying to do, and it was very frustrating to see that feedback. On longer reflection, though, this was really great input because it meant that I had failed to explain to that student what we were trying to do, right? That I hadn't shown them what my goals were so that they could align their own approach with that, and it just caused needless frustration and felt like a soup of different ideas rather than anything that was organized in a way that they could use. So I think usually I don't get a lot of great insight from these the first time I read them, but I always try to go back maybe 6 months later and read it with a cooler head and make changes based on that. I think also, though, we can get ideas about teaching from much less likely places. So one of my, I think, most fun changes to my thinking about teaching happened in response to playing a video game that made me think very, very differently about my courses. So in, I think, 2007 or 2008, Valve released Portal. So I'm not sure how many of you have had the opportunity to play this, but it is, I think, still one of the most delightful games of the millennium. It's basically a first-person puzzle game where you use, as if you had a gun, you paint these portals on different surfaces. They are basically an exit and an entrance portal, and you can move your character or objects through them, changing momentum and position as you do that. And the idea is basically to move yourself towards the exit of a room. This is a fantastic game with a wry sense of humor, highly recommended. Unfortunately, it's also very short. This is maybe 3 hours or so of gameplay. So I got to the end of this and was disappointed that it was over and was looking for other things to do. And this was actually the first game I encountered that actually shipped with a developer's commentary track. So after you completed it, you could walk through the game, and there would occasionally be these speech bubbles that you could click on, and it would play for you some commentary by the people who actually developed the game, where they explained their thinking about it. Okay? And this was a revelation to me, because when I listened to their descriptions, and I'll read this since I don't think it's quite legible. This says, we spend a huge portion of the game introducing a series of gameplay tools, then layering these tools into increasingly difficult puzzles, which is exactly every chemistry class, right? You introduce a series of different tools, a series of different equations or strategies or reactions, and you build them into these increasingly sophisticated problems where the goal is to put those together. So everything in the design of this game, over maybe 40 minutes of commentary track, seemed to echo something that I was trying to do in my class. And their approach to puzzle design had just incredible overlap that made me rethink lots of things that I was doing in my course. So this I think would be hard to get into in a lot of detail without talking a lot more about chemistry. But they talk about the key goal being to encourage players to spend their time and effort in productive ways rather than working around the intention of the developer. Well, I can say exactly the same thing, just replacing players with students, because I'm trying to direct my students to use their time efficiently, study the things that are actually aligned with my goals for the course, rather than short-circuit that and somehow get their A by other means. The same thing is true of designing activities. Right? I want them to be open-ended enough to challenge students to think about how to do them, but not so open-ended that students get lost and don't know where to go. So this idea of giving some direction without undermining that open-endedness, I think, is critical to both enterprises. The designers talked a lot about how they use sort of subtle clues to direct students in the right places or direct players in the right directions. And for students, it's the same situation. When do I give them tips about how to solve the problem? When do I not do that? And maybe more important than any of these, if my class is actually that much like a game, is that maybe an indictment of my class, right? Am I actually trying to teach them or to invoke a character in the game? Am I actually just role-playing GLaDOS when I'm teaching my class? So I actually have that. That's a check that I think about every semester as I'm designing activities for the class. Is this for me or is this for my students? And is it just a puzzle for my own enjoyment or is it really valuable pedagogically? So just to close, I think every instructor carries some set of preconceptions into every class that they teach, and it's really worth deliberate introspection to think about which of those preconceptions are really good ideas for teaching. I think that we can get a lot of great ideas about how to teach more effectively, not just from in the classroom, but from less likely sources. And I think every class is going to be uniquely served by a specific set of approaches. So I hope even if some of the specific strategies I've talked about maybe aren't useful for what you guys are doing, that this general approach to trying to steadily improve and searching in lots of different environments to find those ideas is useful. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Or not. Okay.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thanks, Andy, for sharing all of your thoughts and insights into teaching. I think we all maybe are interested in how these games are played out in your classroom. So thank you all, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks, hopefully.
Your meeting has ended.